John W. Campbell, who also wrote Who Goes There, who was an extraordinary character. He edited astounding stories. He edited this big science fiction magazine in the 1930s. And that was very much the kind of launching pad for a lot of the kind of great science fiction writers, Asimov, A. Van Vogt, all these kind of people. And a lot of kind of big science fiction stories into movie terms came from the original magazine. The Day the Earth Stood Still, Incredible Shrinking Man. Those kind of 30s magazines were the kind of the birth of the B movie in a sense. They began in the 1930s as kind of stories. They became B movies in the 1950s with the kind of the spice of the atomic era and all those things going on. And then it kind of got reinterpreted in the 80s and 90s with the kind of modern special effects. So there was a sort of subtextual story in the documentary that I'm telling. It's a little bit about that evolution of science fiction, that it sort of began with these kind of wide-eyed science fiction writers, a little bit sort of paranoid guys, and their journey right through to, these extraordinary films that are eventually made. Now, John W. Campbell is very interesting because obviously I think he very much drew upon H.P. Lovecraft and the ideas of cosmic horror. There's this whole history of stories told about the Antarctic. At the Mountains of Madness is clearly a source for John W. Campbell. So right in the DNA of the thing is this kind of massive world of eldritch gods and many tentacled beings. I mean, it's not explicit because John Carpenter isn't explicit in terms of, he says he's making a very Hawksian film, not only based on the Hawks film, but in principle. So that kind of means that it's a film told in the now. There's no backstory in the thing, or very, very little backstory in the thing. It's all about what's happening in front of you, which is the Howard Hawks way. Yet, in its kind of seeds, in its antecedents, there is Lovecraft, and obviously there is this kind of history of science fiction. The other element that's fascinating about John W. Campbell is that he wrote the story Who Goes There, on which the film is sort of very much kind of based. And his mother was an identical twin. And his aunt, I think, and I'm reading into this a little bit, because had some kind of jealousy over her sister. It sort of was very protective about her sister and didn't like her sister's son, didn't like John W. Campbell. And if his aunt was visiting, he would come home from school and see this woman who looked like his mother, but never behaved like his mother. She was kind of cold to him and resistant. And you see, there is the start of the story. It's like, is who I'm seeing really who I'm seeing? Is the woman I love suddenly somebody different? And the soul of the story, as John Carpenter says, is the incredible idea that you have an alien that has come to Earth, and its key ability is it can mimic, and it can, take over a human and effectively replace that human, and the other humans would not know. And for Carpenter, that was the key to the story. That is what's clever about it. I mean, when he cast Kurt Russell, who's now on our screen as the great MacReady, his pitch to Kurt Russell was, this isn't necessarily a monster movie, because I think Russell was a bit resistant to that. He says this is a film about paranoia. Fundamentally, this is a story about paranoia. The rest is just the window dressing, as it were. And you think, well, and Kurt Russell said, I got that straight away. And then you get that in the sense that once you understand that's the film Carpenter's making, it becomes much more illuminating to watch it again. You watch all the creature effects in a different way because they become a metaphor for this kind of paranoia. And you will look at this kind of group of men at Outpost 31, and they are very much a group already on the brink of falling apart, even before the thing turns up. So there is an extraordinary sort of legacy that leads you up to the doorstep. I mean, I haven't really touched upon Howard Hawks and Christian Nyby made a version of the Campbell story in the 50s, which is a little bit more B-movie, a little bit more man in a suit. But that was one of Carpenter's favourite films. And you see in Halloween, they're watching it on a movie screen. Jamie Lee Curtis is babysitting and she's watching it on a movie screen. And Carpenter said the only reason that is because he already had the videotape of it. It was one of the very first videotapes he'd got hold of. So while Carpenter is always resistant to going, oh, it's based on this, it's based on that, and influenced by this, there is a big legacy behind the film.